But though we are led after this manner by the natural propensity of the imagination to ascribe a continued existence to those sensible objects or perceptions which we find to resemble each other in their interrupted appearance, yet a very little reflection and philosophy is sufficient to make us perceive the fallacy of that opinion. I have already observed that there is an intimate connection betwixt those two principles of a continued and of a distinct or independent existence, and that we no sooner establish the one than the other follows as a necessary consequence. It is the opinion of a continued existence which first takes place, and without much study or reflection draws the other along with it, wherever the mind follows its first and most natural tendency. But when we compare experiments and reason a little upon them, we quickly perceive that the doctrine of the independent existence of our sensible perceptions is contrary to the plainest experience. This leads us backward upon our footsteps to perceive our error in attributing a continued existence to our perceptions, and is the origin of many very curious opinions, which we shall here endeavor to account for. It will first be proper to observe a few of those experiments which convince us that our perceptions are not possessed of any independent existence. When we press one eye with a finger, we immediately perceive all the objects to become double, and one half of them to be removed from their common and natural position. But as we do not attribute a continued existence to both these perceptions, and as they are both of the same nature, we clearly perceive that all our perceptions are dependent on our organs and the disposition of our nerves and animal spirits. This opinion is confirmed by the seeming increase and diminution of objects according to their distance, by the apparent alterations in their figure, by the changes in their color and other qualities from our sickness and distempers, and by an infinite number of other experiments of the same kind, from all which we learn that our sensible perceptions are not possessed of any distinct or independent existence.
It's actually quite a the hands-on approach, right? Hands on your eye approach, right? It's like I like this. I really like this approach, and I like to, in my own way of doing philosophy, to try to find examples like this that sort of, well, you can check this on your own, right? And his approach is this. They said, well, I experienced this. He does, argue as if it follows axiomatically without stating it, that because he has these kinds of experience and these understandings of his sort of mental ontology, that goes for everyone else also. That doesn't necessarily follow without you stating it, you could say, right? But sort of it's built into why you're doing philosophy. So I guess you could maybe argue that you don't need to make the axiom. I would do it anyway, right? But it's this hands-on. It doesn't have to be, cloud castle, fantastical, all sorts of pie in the sky kind of philosophy, right? Just press one eye and you will see, you see things double. That means that which one is right. You could say that you normally wouldn't do anything. Then things are stable. You could say that it's not double, and then unless you screw around with your experience. You drink a pint of beer or whatever, right? You start to see some funny colors and pink elephants, whatever. Maybe it takes more than a pint, right? But it points to the it points in the direction, in my opinion, that what you experience is just that which the mind creates. It's not an external world that sort of somehow reverse or codes itself into little quantas that can travel through your eyes and then be reverse engineered back into, decoded into a one-to-one representation of something that isn't similar to your representation, right? It's ridiculous to claim that your experiences are somehow the same as something that are outside in a realm you don't even have access to, right? So of course it sort of built into the system that what you experience is what the mind has come up with for some reason, right? That you can't get to. You can't get to why you can only create stories about it, right? So when you screw around with it, the representation, the objects change in a way, you could say, right? And so it points in the direction that they don't have some kind of settled physicality, if you want to put it that way, right? And I agree with him. As so far as I can understand him, I agree with him. Now he might go a little overboard in his metaphysics or ontology here, but as he seems to have done prior. But it's the whole idea that your experience is not the thing itself, right? So
the natural consequence of this reasoning should be that our perceptions have no more a continued than an independent existence. And indeed, philosophers have so far run into this opinion that they change their system and distinguish, as we shall do for the future, betwixt perceptions and objects, of which the former are supposed to be interrupted and perishing, and different at every different return, the latter to be uninterrupted, and to preserve a continued existence and identity. But however philosophical this new system may be esteemed, I assert that it is only a palliative remedy, and that it contains all the difficulties of the vulgar system, with some others that are peculiar to itself. There are no principles either of the understanding or fancy which lead us directly to embrace this opinion of the double existence of perceptions and objects, nor can we arrive at it but by passing through the common hypothesis of the identity and continuance of our interrupted perceptions. Were we not first persuaded that our perceptions are our only objects and continue to exist even when they no longer make their appearance to the senses, we should never be led to think that our perceptions and objects are different, and that our objects alone preserve a continued existence.
That might actually be a decently good argument, that because if you always had an object present in some kind of perception, you wouldn't discuss whether it had continued existence, because it would sort of be built into it. I don't know if I'm not sure I understand it completely, but like a fish that doesn't, metaphorically, if you ask a fish, what do you think about the water? Water? What water? It's everywhere, right? It's there all the time, right? It's everywhere. So it's this kind of things that are always there are not discussed in a way, right? Because it's always there, so you don't need it. It's just there, right? But the problem of experience and not having experience, and inferring an existence of when the ball runs under the sofa, right? You don't expect that the ball is disappearing or something like that. You are expecting it to still be there, though you don't have experience of it. And it tends to be there if you stick your head down and look for it, right? And grab it again and so on. So this kind of object constancy is not knowledge of whatever object as such, but it's a functional model for what to expect to find in the future. Or at least it's a model for it. Whether or not it's functional, well, depends on whether or not it's going to be the case in the future, whatever you're supposedly predicting. So, yeah, well, maybe I don't really understand what he's trying to say here.
The latter hypothesis has no primary recommendation either to reason or the imagination, but acquires all its influence on the imagination from the former. This proposition contains two parts, which we shall endeavor to prove as distinctly and clearly as such abstruse subjects will permit. As to the first part of the proposition, that this philosophical hypothesis has no primary recommendation either to reason or the imagination, we may soon satisfy ourselves with regard to reason by the following reflections. The only existences of which we are certain are perceptions, which, being immediately present to us by consciousness, command our strongest assent and are the first foundation of all our conclusions. The only conclusion we can draw from the existence of one thing to that of another is by means of the relation of cause and effect, which shews that there is a connection betwixt them, and that the existence of one is dependent on that of the other. The idea of this relation is derived from past experience, by which we find that two beings are constantly conjoined together, and are always present at once to the mind. But as no beings are ever present to the mind but perceptions, it follows that we may observe a conjunction or a relation of cause and effect between different perceptions, but can never observe it between perceptions and objects. It is impossible, therefore, that from the existence or any of the qualities of the former, we can ever form any conclusion concerning the existence of the latter, or ever satisfy our reason in this particular. It is no less certain that this philosophical system has no primary recommendation to the imagination, and that that faculty would never of itself and by its original tendency have fallen upon such a principle. I confess it will be somewhat difficult to prove this to the full satisfaction of the reader, because it implies a negative, which in many cases will not admit of any positive proof. If anyone would take the pains to examine this question, and would invent a system to account for the direct origin of this opinion from the imagination, we should be able, by the examination of that system, to pronounce a certain judgment in the present subject. Let it be taken for granted that our perceptions are broken and interrupted, and however like, are still different from each other, and let any one upon this supposition shew why the fancy, directly and immediately, proceeds to the belief of another existence resembling these perceptions in their nature, but yet continued and uninterrupted and identical, and after he has done this to my satisfaction, I promise to renounce my present opinion. Meanwhile, I cannot forbear concluding from the very abstractness and difficulty of the first supposition that it is an improper subject for the fancy to work upon. Whoever would explain the origin of the common opinion concerning the continued and distinct existence of body must take the mind in its common situation and must proceed upon the supposition that our perceptions are our only objects and continue to exist even when they are not perceived. Though this opinion be false, it is the most natural of any, and has alone any primary recommendation to the fancy. As to the second part of the proposition, that the philosophical system acquires all its influence on the imagination from the vulgar one, we may observe that this is a natural and unavoidable consequence of the foregoing conclusion, that it has no primary recommendation to reason or the imagination. For as the philosophical system is found by experience to take hold of many minds, and in particular of all those who reflect ever so little on this subject, it must derive all its authority from the vulgar system, since it has no original authority of its own. The manner in which these two systems, though directly contrary, are connected together, may be explained as follows.
I'll have to admit I'm quite lost in this discussion here. I'm not sure what is going on, to be honest. So I will refrain from commenting further.
The imagination naturally runs on in
to comment anyway, I find that I might have misunderstood what he's doing. I'll be open to that conclusion. But it sounds to me like he doesn't really have a good argument for claiming the constant existence of objects without perception. I don't find it feels like he's juggling words around and okay, if you can come up with an experiment that shows this, okay, I might be convinced otherwise, but so far I'm going with this sort of, it sounds polemic rather than philosophical. That's just my impression. So
this train of thinking. Our perceptions are our only objects. Resembling perceptions are the same, however broken.
But I don't understand why he argues like this. Our perceptions are our only objects, but a perception is not an object. It's either a perception. A perception is either an impression or an idea. So perceptions are either ideas and impression, and they can both be objects or what? So there's something that doesn't fit here. Otherwise, I don't understand what he means by an object, right? So the use of the words here are contrary to the structure of his ontology, in my opinion. There's something that it doesn't fit. There's something wrong. And since there are a few of these where I don't understand how the use of the terms doesn't fit with my understanding what they're supposed to mean, with the way they're put together in particular sentences. So doesn't help me understand what he's trying to say, right?
Or uninterrupted in their appearance. This appearing interruption is contrary to the identity. The interruption consequently extends not beyond the appearance, and the perception or object really continues to exist even when absent from us. Our sensible perceptions have, therefore, a continued and uninterrupted existence. But as a little reflection destroys this conclusion that our perceptions have a continued existence by shewing that they have a dependent one, it would naturally be expected that we must altogether reject the opinion that there is such a thing in nature as a continued existence, which is preserved even when it no longer appears to the senses. The case,
I need to dig into that one. Sometimes I'm not sure if he argues, he makes his own arguments, or he makes somebody else's argument. Sometimes, I thought it was him arguing his own, but he's presenting some other argument that he's going to refute now, right? So it's also mixed up in, is it him arguing or is presenting somebody else's argument, which is going to say that doesn't work, and now I'm going to present my argument. Sometimes it's confusing, right? So it doesn't help me get on board with what he's saying. Okay, he says, but as little reflections destroys, as a little reflection destroys this conclusion, that our perceptions have a continued existence by showing that they have a dependent one, it would naturally be expected that we must altogether reject the opinion that there is such a thing in nature as continued existence, which is preserved even when it no longer appears in the senses. Okay, now he names something called nature. What is nature? Is that an impression or an idea? It can't be an idea unless it has first been an impression. So, thing in nature, a thing. So, a thing, is that also an object or what? Now, that's bad philosophy, right? Exchanging terms, using terms left and right. I don't like that at all, right? If you are building something, you cannot start to use other terms than terms that has already been settled clearly what they mean. And you're not going to use other terms that might be confusing or overlapping or just what the hell do they mean in this context and so on, right? That is bad philosophy, right?
However, is otherwise. Philosophers are so far from rejecting the opinion of a continued existence upon rejecting that of the independence and continuance of our sensible perceptions, that though all sects agree in the latter sentiment, the former, which is, in a manner, its necessary consequence, has been peculiar to a few extravagant skeptics, who, after all, maintained that opinion in words only, and were never able to bring themselves sincerely to believe it. There is a great difference betwixt such opinions as we form after a calm and profound reflection, and such as we embrace by a kind of instinct or natural impulse on account of their suitableness and conformity to the mind. If these opinions become contrary, it is not difficult to foresee which of them will have the advantage. As long as our attention is bent upon the subject, the philosophical and studied principle may prevail. But the moment we relax our thoughts, nature will display herself and draw us back to our former opinion. Nay, she has sometimes such an influence that she can stop our progress, even in the midst of our most profound reflections, and keep us from running on with all the consequences of any philosophical opinion. Thus, though we clearly perceive the dependence and interruption of our perceptions, we stop short in our career, and never, upon that account, reject the notion of an independent and continued existence. That opinion has taken such deep root in the imagination that it is impossible ever to eradicate it, nor will any strained metaphysical conviction of the dependence of our perceptions be sufficient for that purpose. But though our natural and obvious principles here prevail above our studied reflections, it is certain there must be some struggle and opposition in the case, at least so long as these rejections retain any force or vivacity. In order to set ourselves at ease in this particular, we contrive a new hypothesis, which seems to comprehend both these principles of reason and imagination. This hypothesis is the philosophical one of the double existence of perceptions and objects, which pleases our reason in allowing that our dependent perceptions are interrupted and different, and at the same time is agreeable to the imagination in attributing a continued existence to something else, which we call objects. This philosophical...
Okay, I think I got that argument from before. Because we have an interrupted, we need to explain the interrupted. But if I turn around, I don't see the tree or the elephant anymore. I turn around and there the elephant is, and it's exactly the same, experience, right? Impression. Then we would, because it's interrupted, but we get back to exactly the same. We create the idea of some external thing that we are looking at towards, creating the idea of I have an impression of something that keeps existing beyond me, to make sure that when I turn around, or not to make sure, but responsible for keeping that in my unintended perception when I look back at it, so to say, right? So that creates the idea of me being the onlooker to some external thing that is a eternal or what's the term he uses? Continued existence, right? That's actually an interesting angle. I actually like that kind of thinking. I find that to be fairly good thinking. I will highlight this one.
System, therefore, is the monstrous offspring of two principles which are contrary to each other, which are both at once embraced by the mind, and which are unable mutually to destroy each other. The imagination tells us that our resembling perceptions have a continued and uninterrupted existence, and are not annihilated by their absence. Reflection tells us that even our resembling perceptions are interrupted in their existence, and different from each other. The contradiction betwixt these opinions we elude by a new fiction, which is conformable to the hypothesis both of reflection and fancy, by ascribing these contrary qualities to different existences, the interruption to perceptions and the continuance to objects. Nature is obstinate and will not quit the field, however strongly attacked by reason. And at the same time, reason is so clear in the point that there is no possibility of disguising her. Not being able to reconcile these two enemies, we endeavor to set ourselves at ease as much as possible by successively granting to each whatever it demands, and by feigning a double existence where each may find something that has all the conditions it desires. Were we fully convinced that our resembling perceptions are continued and identical and independent, we should never run into this opinion of a double existence, since we should find satisfaction in our first supposition and would not look beyond. Again, were we fully convinced that our perceptions are dependent and interrupted and different, we should be as little inclined to embrace the opinion of a double existence, since in that case we should clearly perceive the error of our first supposition of a continued existence, and would never regard it any farther. It is, therefore, from the intermediate situation of the mind that this opinion arises, and from such an adherence to these two contrary principles as makes us seek some pretext to justify our receiving both, which happily at last is found in the system of a double existence. Another advantage of this philosophical system is its similarity to the vulgar one, by which means we can humor our reason for a moment when it becomes troublesome and solicitous, and yet upon its least negligence or inattention can easily return to our vulgar and natural notions. Accordingly, we find that philosophers neglect not this advantage, but immediately upon leaving their closets, mingle with the rest of mankind in those exploded opinions that our perceptions are our only objects, and continue identically and uninterruptedly the same in all their interrupted appearances. There are other particulars of this system wherein we may remark its dependence on the fancy in a very conspicuous manner. Of these, I shall observe the two following. First, we suppose external objects to resemble internal perceptions. I have already shewn that the relation of cause and effect can never afford us any just conclusion from the existence or qualities of our perceptions to the existence of external continued objects. And I shall further add that even though they could afford such a conclusion, we should never have any reason to infer that our objects resemble our perceptions. That opinion, therefore, is derived from nothing but the quality of the fancy above explained, that it borrows all its ideas from some precedent perception. We can never conceive anything but perceptions, and therefore must make everything resemble them. Secondly,
So, what I think I hear him say is, we infer a double existence, that we have a perceptual existence or idea of perception that is interrupted, and then there's an uninterrupted, coherent existence that those interrupted perceptions are based on. But we like to, I'm not sure whether he understands this, the materialist paradox yet, right? But it seems he's honing in on it, right? And we say, okay, that object out there is of the same kind as my experience. Just so that I'm interrupted, but I'm not interrupted. I see it directly when I'm not when I am interrupted. Sorry, I have the idea of it still that takes its place, right? As quite vivid, maybe idea, because I just had the experience. Now I don't have it. It's interrupted. It's gone because I turned around or whatever. But I still have a very strong idea of that thing, and when I turn around, there it is again. So I could see an argument that because my idea of it is identical to my impression of it, it sort of melts together to an idea. It must be like that. Something like that. Maybe I'm misunderstanding, but yeah.
We suppose our objects in general to resemble our perceptions, so we take it for granted that every particular object resembles that perception which it causes. The relation of cause and effect determines us to join the other of resemblance, and the ideas of these existences being already united together in the fancy by the former relation, we naturally add the latter to complete the union. We have a strong propensity to complete every union by joining new relations to those which we have before observed betwixt any ideas, as we shall have occasion to observe presently in section 5. Having thus given an account of all the systems, both popular and philosophical, with regard to external existences, I cannot forbear giving vent to a certain sentiment which arises upon reviewing those systems. I begun this subject with premising that we ought to have an implicit faith in our senses, and that this would be the conclusion I should draw from the whole of my reasoning. But to be ingenuous, I feel myself at present of a quite contrary sentiment, and am more inclined to repose no faith at all in my senses, or rather imagination, than to place in it such an implicit confidence. I cannot conceive how such trivial qualities of the fancy, conducted by such false suppositions, can ever lead to any solid and rational system. They are the coherence and constancy of our perceptions which produce the opinion of their continued existence, though these qualities of perceptions have no perceivable connection with such an existence. The constancy of our perceptions has the most considerable effect, and yet is attended with the greatest difficulties. It is a gross illusion to suppose that our resembling perceptions are numerically the same, and it is this illusion which leads us into the opinion that these perceptions are uninterrupted and are still existent even when they are not present to.
Oh, human. Ah. Ah. Get. Could you be a little more concise and precise and short, right? That would be nice. It's a little too much, this, for me, right?
To the senses. This is the case with our popular system. And as to our philosophical one, it is liable to the same difficulties, and is over and above loaded with this absurdity that it at once denies and establishes the vulgar supposition. Philosophers deny our resembling perceptions to be identically the same and uninterrupted, and yet have so great a propensity to believe them such that they arbitrarily invent a new set of perceptions to which they attribute these qualities. I say a new set of perceptions, for we may well suppose in general, but it is impossible for us distinctly to conceive objects to be in their nature anything but exactly the same with perceptions. What then can we look for from this confusion of groundless and extraordinary opinions, but error and falsehood? And how can we justify to ourselves any belief we repose in them? This skeptical doubt, both with respect to reason and the senses, is a malady which can never be radically cured, but must return upon us every moment, however we may chase it away, and sometimes may seem entirely free from it. It is impossible upon any system to defend either our understanding or senses, and we but expose them farther when we endeavor to justify them in that manner. As the skeptical doubt arises naturally from a profound and intense reflection on those subjects, it always increases the farther we carry our reflections, whether in opposition or conformity to it. Carelessness and inattention alone can afford us any remedy. For this reason, I rely entirely upon them, and take it for granted, whatever may be the reader's opinion at this present moment, that an hour hence he will be persuaded there is both an external and internal world, and going upon that supposition, I intend to examine some general systems, both ancient and modern, which have been proposed of both, before I proceed to a more particular inquiry concerning our impressions. This will not, perhaps, in the end, be found foreign to our present purpose. End of file 34.
Okay, that was a bit of a polemic thing. I'm not entirely sure what he's trying to say here. It feels bloated, in my opinion. I like down to basics, straight to the point, simple statements, right? Like it to be simple so I don't feel like I'm being, fluffied up by language, right? So I know this maybe was that was the way they did it back 300 years ago, and I'll give him a lot of leeway in this regard, but it doesn't help me trying to get to this understanding. I think he's trying to argue that there is an external world and that he can say something about it, but he's going to the next chapter is about ancient philosophy, I think. Let me have a look. The ancient philosophy of the ancient philosophy. He's probably going into Platonism or Aristotelianism, whatever, whatever. Berkeley, maybe, right? Modern philosophers later. Descartes for sure, right? So I think I'll leave it for now and see what is going to be. This is more polemic. I don't think necessarily the word polemic is a good term to use, but I can't find any better, right? It's he's sort of like, he's more like he's lecturing at this point. It's like he's lecturing on philosophy rather than doing philosophy. This is sort of what it feels like, and I'm not particularly fond of that. And then so giving us a history of philosophy here, is that really necessary? Just get to the freaking point, man, right? But maybe I can deduce something from his metaphysical understandings from how he describes these things. So I'm hoping for that in the next part. So please share, like, and subscribe. Consider a donation, links below. And otherwise, see you in the next one.